Welcome to the second program in a 5-part series dealing with the question, why revolution in Latin America? The first program dealt with the theme myth and reality, essentially the differences between the image of Latin America and its rather different reality. It tried to show that the knowledge of the countries to the south that we have is very limited. Life is incredibly difficult for the majority of people there. Annual per capita income, for example, is less than $100 for 1 in every 3 people. Latin America, we showed, is a time bomb waiting to explode. This second program provides a historical backdrop to this very harsh reality. It offers an overview of Latin America for 4 centuries, from 1520, when the Spanish first became very interested in conquering this vast and very rich area, until 1910, when this country's first social revolution broke out in Mexico. It tries to show that the seeds of repression, social injustice and exploitation that we now associate with Latin America were sown during this period by a ruthless system which plundered the wealth of the area, established a rigid social structure and brutally punished all forms of dissent. The first victims of this vicious colonial system were the indigenous peoples who had lived in the area since around 7000 BC. Contrary to the myth of the naive noble savage, they had developed sophisticated societies. By the arrival of the conquistadores, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, and what is now Mexico City, boasted some 300,000 inhabitants, far larger than London, Rome or Paris, and 5 times the size of Madrid at that time. This model gives some idea of the center of the city, one built incidentally on an immense lake, as the drawing behind shows. Founded in 1325, this city was the capital of an empire controlling all of central Mexico and boasting tremendous wealth, particularly gold, as the Spanish soon discovered. Perhaps no Indian people disproves the black myth of Indian inferiority as much as the Mayas, a people based in Central America around the Yucatan Peninsula and Guatemala. Their language was so sophisticated that it is still only partially understood. In astronomy, they continue to amaze modern-day scientists at the detail of their maps of the heavens, their ability to predict solar eclipses and other natural phenomena, and by the development of mathematics. Not only were they skillful architects, but their work in weaving, figurines, pottery and jewelry still astonish us, some 1200 years after they were first produced. From the point of view of social structure, none of the pre-Hispanic, or it can be argued European peoples, had developed as sophisticated a society as the Incas, whose vast empire, with a population of between 7 and 12 million, stretched some 2,500 miles from Ecuador to Chile. It was a military empire, ruling over subject peoples both by persuasion and force, with a definite civilizing mission of spreading the Incas' language, culture and religion. The Incas' success can be seen from the area throughout the Andean area where their language, Quechua, is still spoken, and by their fabulous architecture, still as sturdy as ever. These unemployed musicians have a fabulous backdrop for their entertainment. The Incas' communication network, with a sophisticated road system, stretched to all parts of the empire. They also possessed agricultural techniques, including the skillful terracing of land on steep mountainsides, and fascinating buildings for which no mortar or cement were used. All are worthy of note. Their economy was based on a communal model with virtually no private property. As in other Indian communities, the keystones were the village lands owned by all. The produce was divided into 3 parts, with a third going to the rulers, a third to the villagers, and a third being kept in storage, both for the elderly and the infirm, and in times of emergency, when these stocks were distributed to all. In agricultural matters, then, they are thought to have been totally self-sufficient. Unfortunately for the Incas and most of the other Indian peoples, both the weak and strong points of their system was this paternalistic, highly stratified society that was totally dependent on the will of the elite. With the leader removed, as the Spanish quickly appreciated, the whole governmental structure collapsed. Immediately after destroying the stranglehold of this elite, the Spanish simply assumed the position of the rulers, and the system continued much as before. The conquista of the Spanish virtually destroyed all vestiges of self-respect among the Indian peoples. Before, as can be seen in the murals of the Mexican artist Diego Rivera, they enjoyed a reasonably harmonious existence, living well, were proud of their culture, respected their gods, and developed a marvelously intricate and sophisticated culture. The arrival of the Spanish changed all that. When the Spanish arrived in Mexico in November 1519, they had come, in the words of the secretary to the greatest and possibly the most violent conquistador, Cortés, to serve God and His Majesty and to get rich. Cortés himself was more direct, saying, "I came here for gold, not to till the soil like a peasant." Within the short space of 30 years, they had done just that, particularly after gold was found in large quantities, spreading the Spanish Empire from the north of present-day California to the south of Chile. By 1548, major cities were founded in Havana, Mexico City, Quito, Lima, Buenos Aires, Asunción, Bogotá, Santiago de Chile, and La Paz. Conquest soon gave way to colonialism. This new religious crusade of the Spanish deserves some attention, for it explains just how ruthless was the destruction of all Indian religions they encountered. Spain, after nearly 8 centuries of domination by the Moors, had finally reconquered all of its national territory by 1492, the year in which Columbus arrived in the so-called New World. Encouraged by this, and also desirous of both finding a new source of spices from the Indies, Columbus died in 1508, still convinced he'd discovered India, and desirous too of exposing the infidel to a new battlefront, the conquistadores brutally destroyed all pagan images. Often, as in the case of Mexico City's cathedral, they used the Indian temple stones to build their own cathedrals and churches. Later, with the help of the infamous Inquisition, the Spanish colonial system ensured the continuation of their religious orthodoxy. All dissent, of course, was dealt with in a swift fashion. For 300 years, the Spanish controlled this area, soon to be joined by the Portuguese, who were afraid that their Iberian neighbors' gold lust might cause them to incorporate what soon became Brazil. The price and human suffering of this colonial policy is still not properly appreciated. In fact, the combined populations of the Aztecs, Incas, and Mayas amounted to an estimated 70 to 90 million people in 1520. By 1581, 1/3 of Latin America's Indians had been wiped out, and by 1650, the Indian population was reduced to 3.5 million. The causes? To a large extent, this was due to a lack of resistance to diseases brought by the Europeans, most dramatically smallpox. There was also, of course, the savage exploitation of the Indians by the Spanish settlers, who were granted extensive plots of land and large numbers of Indians to be disposed of at will. In Haiti, many Indians, rather than continue under these brutal overlords, poisoned their children and hanged themselves. During the course of the colonial era, while life was exceptionally satisfying for the tiny Spanish elite which administered the colonies, for the vast majority of Indians and black slaves, some 10 million of whom were imported from Africa to replace the ever-depleting Indian stocks, life became increasingly harsh. From being the proud masters of their own fate, inventors of complex surgical techniques, including lobotomies, consummate astronomers and mathematicians, skilled craftsmen and architects, and knowledgeable agronomists, they now entered a downward path of ever-increasing humiliation from which they have still not recovered, their cultural identity in ruins. But not only were they the victims of this savage exploitation, with any dissent being punished in a brutal fashion, they were also the fuel of the colonial economic system, the cheap labor supply which, for more than 400 years, still attracts investors to Latin America, foreigners looking for a sound investment climate. As René Dumont has correctly pointed out, the Indians suffered a traumatic identity crisis, one that we do not fully appreciate. This Indian's ancestors, answering to no man, used once to cultivate the rich soil of the ownerless plains. Now he works for nothing to gain the right to cultivate the poor slopes of the mountain. Between 1520 and 1810, time virtually stood still in Latin America. The social structure, as in the motherland, was incredibly rigid. In the colonies, however, there was one fundamental difference, since not only was there a massive social gulf between the tiny white majority and the massive coloured population, but there also existed a further tremendous social division between the whites themselves. On the one hand were the administrators, known as the peninsulares, or Spanish-born, who held virtually all the major administrative posts. On the other were the criollos, or creoles, who were white but had committed the original sin of having been born in the colonies. Ridiculous as it may sound to us, many pregnant mothers travelled back to Spain so that their offspring, denied all access to the innermost government ranks, would then be able to have a chance. The Creoles came to control commercial life in the colonies for obvious reasons, especially in view of their wealth and education, and of course their privileged colour. They felt frustrated and resentful at being excluded from power. In 1810, when the movement for independence from Spain began, it was generally they who provided the money to finance the insurrections, the first of the so-called revolutions. If this colonial society can justifiably be termed a closed, static one, the same can also be said about the stagnant economic structure, which deliberately maintained the colonies as the poor relation. For not only were they obliged to send all the raw materials only to the motherland, but also they were even forbidden from trading with each other. Nor were they allowed to develop any of their own industries which might rival the imported Spanish products, such as oil, wine, or textiles. Their purpose then was to be a valuable source of raw materials for Spain, and to purchase, at the price set by the Spanish government, all finished products imported to the colonies by the annual fleet. There was to be no doubt then as to who was the master. With minor changes in this structure initiated in the 1780s, this system, which of course was intended to keep Spanish America fully dependent on Spain, continued for almost 300 years. Finally, during the period 1810 to 1820, after 3 centuries of this stifling system, the movement to achieve independence burst forth. This was largely due to Napoleon seizing Spain in 1810, illustrated here by Goya's fabulous painting. The actions of the reactionary Fernando VII upon his return to power in 1814, and the examples of the recent French and American revolutions. Behind all the fighting, however, were the Creoles, eager to take over the privileged position of the Spanish overlords. It's tempting to see these wars of independence as revolutions. However, this is a little superficial, since the dictionary definition of revolution is a fundamental change or complete restructuring. With the notable exception of Mexico, where in 1810 a progressive priest, Father Hidalgo, led a social revolt supported by the Indians, the wars of independence can best be described as a game of violent musical chairs. One group, the Spanish, were edged out of its privileged position, while another, the Creoles, slid into its place. As an illustration of how unrevolutionary the whole process was, Father Hidalgo in Mexico was turned on by none other than the Creoles, was arrested, and was then executed. Beneath the revolutionary foam then lay some very still waters. This period, 1810 to 1910, the century after the so-called struggle for freedom, should have been a period of restructuring for Latin America. In fact, it proved to be a time for social stagnation, uneven economic growth, and an increasing US role in Latin America. As can be seen from these slides taken in the late 1970s, not much had changed. Once again, however, for the vast majority of people at the bottom of the social ladder, there was absolutely no difference. They had simply exchanged overlords. From being the fuel of the colonial productive system, they now passed to that of a neo-colonial structure. Still paid ridiculously low wages. An example, salaries in Mexico, for instance, didn't increase for the 100-year period between 1810 and 1910. Frequently expelled from centuries-old communal landholdings, as in the case of Nicaragua's Rio Blue fields, Argentina's Patagonia, and Mexico's Sonora. Life seemed to go, for these people, from bad to worse. So much for the theory of revolution. To a large extent, the problems awaiting the new independent countries were inevitable. Having always been dependent on the former Spanish masters to make all major decisions, many Creoles, for instance, weren't even allowed to carry guns. Of course, explains the lack of a strong central government. In addition to this political immaturity, however, were other major problems. First, there was a problem of official corruption, since many government officers were awarded to the highest Spanish bidder, who then, of course, had to recoup his losses. There was also the determination of the rich, and especially of the richest landowner of the church, to preserve the status quo and to trample all dissent. Finally, there was the problem of the export economy mentality, since all natural resources were sent abroad for processing. The economic havoc after the wars of independence, the resulting power vacuum after the Spanish defeat, the implementation of idealistic European constitutions, the lack of political tradition, and of course the widespread social problems, still so apparent, all resulted in tremendous chaos. Moreover, since there was no official government army after the Spanish left, there were continuous attempts to wrest control from the central governments. From this struggle emerged the caudillo, the traditional macho Latin American dictator, who tried to force the nation to bow to his will, such as, for instance, Rosas and Santa Anna of the Alamo fame, or their modern-day equivalents, Somoza, Stroessner, or Pinochet. To all, the democratic traditions as we know them was a farce, particularly in view of the illiterate masses of their country. Instead, what was required, they thought, was a firm, strong hand on the governmental reins. In other words, a Latin strongman. There were two new factors which began to change the face of Latin America from 1810 to 1910. The beginnings of an uneven program of industrialization and the ever-increasing US role. The first of these developments made any attempt at economic planning a farce. As we know, virtually all Latin American countries still depend for economic growth upon one or two raw materials. For example, tin in Bolivia, coffee in Colombia, or copper in Chile. Planning an economy based upon these products, whose prices soar and fall on the world markets, is like predicting a clinical epilepsy chart. To give an example, coffee rose from 2 cents a pound in 1889 to 9 cents a pound in 1895, fell to 4 cents a pound in 1896, and then to 2 cents in 1903. Added to the constant political unrest then was the lack of steady economic growth, which of course hindered any solid development of the Latin American nations. This boom and bust cycle is best illustrated by the rubber industry of Brazil, which in just 20 years, 1890 to 1910, increased its share of the national export economy from 10% to 40%. Unfortunately, however, rubber seeds were ingeniously smuggled out of Brazil, propagated in London's Kew Gardens, and then transplanted to the Far East, where rubber trees could be grown in plantations far more economically. As a result, the Brazilian economy again entered a severe depression. This church also illustrates this phenomenon particularly well. There are three distinctive styles, as we can see, corresponding to three different booms in the local economy. When the bust cycle started, construction was halted until the next boom, when a new style was used. By the 1890s, the role of the United States became crucial to Latin America, largely because North America, after edging out the major powers England and Germany, was now investing heavily in Latin America. Largely because of its rich supplies of raw materials and status as a potential market for manufactured goods, Latin America was keenly observed in the United States. As a result, U.S. investment, which amounted to only $304 million in 1897, passed the $1 billion mark in 1908, rose to $1.08 billion in 1914, to $5 billion by 1928. The Capitolio building in Havana, a scaled-down model of the U.S. equivalent, illustrates eloquently the North American influence in Cuba. Added to this economic interest was also a direct political concern with the countries to the south, largely the result of the doctrine of manifest destiny, according to which it was argued that fortune had obviously designated the United States as the beacon of hope for the rest of the underdeveloped world. Be that as it may, what is clear is that between 1803 and 1853, the United States increased its territory tenfold, largely at Latin America's expense. The case of Mexico is of particular interest, since 1/2 of Mexico's surface area was taken by the United States between 1844 and 1848, some 945,000 square miles, comprising the present-day states of Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, Utah, and part of Colorado. Other wheeling and dealing then ensued. We can mention in passing the attempt by the United States to build the Panama Canal. We robbed it fair and square, it was later claimed. And the military occupation of Cuba between 1898 and 1902 after the improperly named Spanish-American War. In all cases can clearly be seen the hand of President Theodore Roosevelt and his philosophy of walk softly but carry a big stick. The big stick would fall with brutal regularity from this point on, long before the communist menace became the smokescreen for this unfortunate bullying. As President Taft would later state, the day is not far distant when 3 stars and stripes at 3 equidistant points will mark our territory, one at the North Pole, another at the Panama Canal, and the third at the South Pole. The whole hemisphere will be ours, in fact, as by virtue of our superiority of race, it already is morally. A study of an official list of U.S. military intervention prepared by the U.S. Senate shows the degree to which this goal was pursued. For some 400 years then, the authoritarian colonial government and under the post-independence model, Latin America simply failed to come to terms with itself. To a large extent, this was unavoidable, given the power vacuum that resulted from the Spanish withdrawal. But it's also true that the resulting liberal governments rapidly lost interest in the masses, the very people who had fought against Spanish oppression. Far more profitable for them was the plan of cooperating with foreign investors, who treated them very well. What did it matter if the country's economy should be sold out? Didn't the gringos have superior technical knowledge anyhow? And the masses, they had always taken what they'd been given, so why should they be different now? Let them eat beans, was the general feeling. In short, powerless central governments, incapable of ruling the nation's destiny and desperately in need of funds both to try and support the country and to provide the stability that was continually being threatened by the rural caudillos. In their desperation, they welcomed in foreign investors at incredibly unfavorable rates for the economy. These then eagerly took control of large sectors of the economy. When the United States replaced the major European powers at the turn of the century, they also showed, as we've seen, that they were fully prepared to intervene to protect their investments. The general economic stagnation of Latin America in the 19th century, precisely at the time when the nearby United States was rapidly increasing its industrial base and therefore needed large supplies of cheap raw materials, as well as a market for its manufactured goods, led it into a fresh stage of dependency, as is the case here with Cuban sugar. Once again, the valuable raw materials were exported abroad, and then the finished products were shipped back. The governments living off taxation resulting from this traffic maintained the status quo. Doing any different for them was suicidal. Foreign investment therefore became the lifestay of the national economy and was therefore given preferential treatment. The latter-day United States Fruit Company and Inco quietly found a comfortable niche in their new country and began making a tidy profit. For the masses, however, life was remarkably similar to before. Indeed, many argued that they had simply exchanged one master for another, particularly in the countryside. The development of the hacienda, based upon stolen Indian land, led to a social and economic system that was closed to the rest of the country. There the peasant was born and buried. There he was forced to buy goods at the company store, usually at inflated prices, with tokens, not money. And there too he was forced to work off hereditary debts by working for the landlord. in some cases working off the debts of relatives he'd never even seen. Here we see a Mexican woman and baby returning to the hacienda in 1980, on which her husband still toils. There were, of course, limited advantages for this paternalistic structure, since his employer wanted to protect the supply of cheap labour. Cheap liquor was sold on feast days, and an interest was shown in the families of the workers, most of whom lived in rudimentary housing provided by the landowners. Of course, the status quo was adhered to rigidly. When all was said and done, the labourers were still serfs. Perhaps worst of all, having lost faith in the goals of independence, they usually became complacent, ingratiating themselves into the master's service. Could they really expect any differently? By 1850, there had been some attempts at industrialization, largely as a result of direct foreign investment, but also because of foreign loans to Latin American entrepreneurs. Another important innovation was the arrival of large numbers of European immigrants towards the end of the 19th century. Buenos Aires, for instance, increased its population from 50,000 in 1889 to 1.5 million in 1914. Here we see an Argentinian woman of German descent in front of a resort town. These workers brought different political ideas from the old country, ideas that soon proved unpopular. Trade unions and leftist political parties sprang up, and strikes, virtually unknown before, started to take place. These were put down brutally. An estimated 9,000 workers were massacred by the army in Iquique in Chile, since they threatened a cozy arrangement. The times they were changing, or so it seemed. If we summarize the social changes that took place during this entire 400-year span, we can see that remarkably little did in fact take place. By 1850, 90% of the population was living in abject poverty. Political power still lay in the hands of the landowning Creole aristocracy, perhaps 2% of the population, who manipulated the peasants at will. Economically, they were no better off. The system, it seemed, would continue ad infinitum. That is, until Mexico underwent a dramatic change, as Latin America's first revolution took place in 1910. Was this to show the future path for Latin America? Would the dreams of independence finally be fulfilled? This will be examined in the next program, which you will see next week.